Lysander's hands trembled slightly as he flipped through the crumbling pages of the ancient tome, his eyes scanning the delicate script in a mixture of disbelief and wonder. The dim light of his study barely illuminated the faded words, casting long shadows that seemed to stretch across the dusty floor. He had spent years, decades even, searching for something, anything, that could halt the relentless march of time against his aging body. The thought of growing frail and fading into nothingness haunted him. He needed something powerful, something that could restore the vigor of his youth. The book in his hands had come to him by chance, an unexpected gift from a traveling merchant who had claimed to have found it in a distant land, far beyond the reaches of common knowledge. The symbols and incantations were like nothing Lysander had ever seen, their meaning cryptic and alien. His eyes narrowed as he traced the lines of one particular passage, a ritual involving a bond between human and magical creature. It spoke of rejuvenation, of vitality returned through a process so intimate and profound it could only be shared between a human and a beast. Lysander's mind raced as he processed the words. The ritual, as described in the ancient text, required a form of connection between the two beings, something that transcended the physical. A bond forged through breath, shared between human and beast. The magic was said to flow from one to the other, rejuvenating both and intertwining their fates. The ritual was dangerous, of course, warning of the unpredictable forces it could unleash. But for Lysander, there was no turning back. This might be his last hope. His heart hammered in his chest as he stood in his study, contemplating the gravity of what he was about to do. The last few years had worn heavily on him. His joints creaked, his skin sagged, and his once vibrant energy had been replaced with a creeping exhaustion that no amount of sleep could remedy. The idea of connecting with a mythical creature seemed absurd, yet at the same time irresistibly alluring. With a deep breath, he set the book down on the desk. The air seemed to hum with an energy all its own as he prepared the space according to the ritual's instructions. Candles were lit, their flames flickering in the quiet room, casting a soft, golden glow. The symbols were drawn in chalk across the floor, forming a perfect circle. A strange sensation washed over him, an electric charge that made his skin prickle. He closed his eyes and muttered the incantation aloud, his voice steady but carrying a strange reverence. The words felt foreign on his tongue, like an ancient song he had somehow forgotten. The temperature in the room dropped suddenly, and Lysander opened his eyes, startled. The circle on the floor began to glow faintly, its symbols pulsing with a life of their own. A low growl echoed through the room, a deep, resonant sound that sent a shiver down his spine. Lysander's breath caught in his throat. Something was happening, something that felt both dangerous and intoxicating. Suddenly, the air in front of him shifted, warping like a mirage. A dark, swirling mass began to form, and Lysander staggered back, his pulse quickening. He had no time to prepare. A flash of movement, sharp and fast, and before he could react, the form solidified. Standing before him was a woman, or something that resembled one. She was tall and powerful, her body covered in fur, her features sharp and angular. Her eyes were a fierce yellow, glowing with an unnatural intensity. Her hair, if it could be called that, was a wild mane of dark, tangled strands, and her ears were pointed, animalistic. Her mouth curled into a snarl, revealing sharp teeth that gleamed in the dim light. She was a beast, but more than that, she was something far beyond what Lysander had ever imagined. His heart pounded as the creature, no, the woman, took a step toward him. The air seemed to crackle with an almost palpable tension, and Lysander instinctively took a step back. Her gaze was predatory, her movements calculated and graceful, like that of a wild animal sizing up its prey. Her breath was shallow, sharp, and Lysander could feel the pull of it in the very core of his being. What are you?" Lysander asked, his voice hoarse with a mixture of awe and fear. She tilted her head, eyes narrowing as she studied him. For a long moment, she said nothing. The room was silent except for the occasional flicker of the candles and the crackling of the magic that surrounded them both. "I am Erin," she finally spoke, her voice low and laced with an animalistic growl. Why have you summoned me? Lysander took another cautious step back, feeling the weight of her gaze on him. I I didn't mean to summon you. I was just, I was trying the ritual. I thought it would. His voice faltered, unsure how to explain himself. He had only meant to use the magic for rejuvenation, not to bring a creature like this into his life. Erin's eyes glinted as she stepped forward again, her body language becoming more predatory. You dare to play with magic you don't understand? Her lips curled into a dangerous smile, revealing those sharp, animalistic teeth. You've bound yourself to me, human. For better or worse, our fates are now intertwined. The weight of her words sank into Lysander's chest like a stone. His breath quickened as he realized the gravity of the situation. The bond, whatever it was real. This creature, this beast woman, was now connected to him in ways that he couldn't yet comprehend. The power of the ritual was unlike anything he had anticipated. Before he could respond, she took another step toward him. The heat from her body was almost tangible, and Lysander felt a strange pull in his chest. It was as if his very essence was being drawn toward her, an irresistible force that he couldn't deny. His body seemed to react to her presence, an involuntary response that made his heart race even faster. Your magic has awakened something in me, Erin said, her voice softer now but no less intense. I am bound to you and you to me. What will you do now, human? Lysander swallowed hard, his thoughts swirling. The energy between them crackled in the air, charged and raw. This wasn't just about rejuvenation anymore. This was something deeper, something that he hadn't planned for, something powerful, primal, and dangerously close. He took a step forward, despite the unease curling in his stomach. He had no idea what he was about to face, but there was no turning back now. His destiny was no longer his own. He was bound to Erin, and the path ahead would be one they would walk together, whether he liked it or not. The morning light seeped through the cracks of the wooden shutters in Lysander's study, casting thin rays across the disheveled room. He sat at his desk, hands buried in his hair, his thoughts a chaotic whirlpool. Across from him, Erin perched near the window, her sharp yellow eyes following his every move. The air between them was thick, heavy with unspoken tension. Erin's presence dominated the small room. She moved with a primal grace, her ears twitching at every faint creak of the floorboards or distant chirp outside. Her wild, wolf-like form was unnerving, but what unsettled Lysander more was the way she seemed so entirely at ease in this strange situation, as if being tethered to a human was just another hunt she had to endure. You've barely said a word since last night, Erin said, her voice low and edged with irritation. She leaned forward, her glowing eyes narrowing. Do humans always stew in silence when faced with their own folly? Lysander glanced at her, his jaw tightening. I wasn't expecting this, he said finally, gesturing vaguely toward her. The ritual wasn't supposed to summon anyone. It was supposed to enhance vitality. Erin let out a dry laugh, the sound both mocking and oddly musical. Enhance vitality? You call forth a bond of ancient magic for something as trivial as that? I don't know whether to pity your ignorance or laugh at your audacity. He bristled under her gaze, her words hitting a nerve. You think I wanted this bond? Whatever happened, it wasn't intentional. If I could reverse it, I would. Her expression darkened, the predatory glint in her eyes sharpening. You think you can just undo a bond like this? You've already felt it, haven't you? She stepped closer, her movements fluid and deliberate. The pull, the way your very breath changes when I'm near. It's not something you can walk away from. Lysander stood abruptly, the chair scraping against the floor. Then what am I supposed to do? Just accept it? Pretend this is normal? His voice wavered, betraying the frustration and fear that simmered beneath the surface. Erin tilted her head, studying him like a predator sizing up its prey. You don't have a choice. The bond is alive now, a thread connecting us. The more you resist it, the tighter it will pull. If you want to survive this, you'll have to face it. Her words hung in the air, heavy and unrelenting. Lysander paced the room, his mind racing for answers. He had spent his entire life studying magic, dedicating himself to unraveling its mysteries. Yet here he stood, powerless against the very force he had sought to harness. As he passed by the window, he caught a glimpse of his reflection in the glass. For a moment, he didn't recognize the man staring back. His face, lined with years of weariness, now seemed different. The tired hollowness in his eyes had softened, replaced by something he couldn't quite place. His skin looked healthier, his posture straighter. The bond had already started to change him. Aaron's voice broke the silence. "You're feeling it, aren't you? The bond is already working through you, renewing what your body has lost." He turned to face her, his brows furrowing. "And what about you? How does this bond affect you?" Aaron's gaze flickered, her expression unreadable. "It awakens something primal," she admitted. "Something I've spent years suppressing. It's not just your vitality that's being restored. The bond works both ways." Her tone was quieter now, almost hesitant, as if admitting this gave away more than she intended. For a brief moment, her fierce demeanor softened, and Lysander glimpsed the vulnerability beneath her wild exterior. The silence between them stretched, no longer heavy with tension, but something else entirely, something fragile. A soft knock at the door broke the moment, making Lysander flinch. He glanced at Aaron, whose ears perked up, her body instantly alert. "Wait here," Lysander said, his voice low. He crossed the room and opened the door just enough to see who was there. A young villager stood nervously on the other side, clutching a basket of bread. "Good morning, Master Lysander," the boy said, his voice trembling slightly. I brought this for you, from my mother. She wanted to thank you for helping us with the harvest spell last month." Lysander forced a smile, trying to hide the unease brewing inside him. "Thank you, Thomas. Tell your mother I'm grateful." The boy nodded quickly, glancing past Lysander into the room. "Is everything all right? There's been strange noises coming from here since last night." "Just some old magic experiments," Lysander said, his tone firm but polite. "Nothing to worry about." The boy hesitated for a moment before nodding again and hurrying off. Lysander closed the door and turned back to find Aaron standing closer than before, her arms crossed and a bemused expression on her face. "Old magic experiments?" she repeated, one brow raised. "Is that what I am now?" He sighed, setting the basket down on the table. "I didn't summon you to be paraded around for the villagers. They wouldn't understand." Her smirk faded, replaced by a flicker of something unreadable. "You're right, they wouldn't. Humans never do." For the first time, Lysander heard something akin to bitterness in her voice. He hesitated, unsure of what to say. But before he could speak, Aaron moved past him, her presence commanding as she inspected the room. Her fingers brushed lightly against the edge of his desk, tracing the intricate carvings etched into the wood. "This is your den," she said, her tone softer now, almost contemplative. "Small, sheltered, safe." She glanced at him over her shoulder, her piercing eyes meeting his. "It suits you. And what of yours?" Lysander asked, curious despite himself. "Where do you belong?" Aaron's gaze darkened, her lips curling into a faint smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "In the wild, among the trees, the wind, the moonlight. My home is where the rules are simple. Survive or perish." The weight of her words settled over them, a stark reminder of how vastly different their worlds were. Yet here they were, bound by a magic neither fully understood. Lysander took a cautious step closer, his voice quieter now. "Do you miss it?" Aaron turned to face him fully, her expression unreadable. For a moment, she seemed to consider his question, her eyes searching his as if trying to gauge his intent. "Do you?" she countered, her voice barely above a whisper. He blinked, taken aback by the question. "Miss what?" "Whatever you've lost," she said simply, her tone carrying an unexpected gentleness. Lysander hesitated, the weight of her question pressing against him. He didn't have an answer, at least not one he was ready to share. Instead, he stepped back, creating a distance that felt necessary, even if he wasn't sure why. Erin watched him for a moment longer before turning away, her movements fluid and deliberate. "You'll need to decide soon," she said, her voice steady but carrying an edge of warning. "The bond will only grow stronger. Running from it won't save you." Her words lingered in the air, a challenge he couldn't ignore. As Lysander watched her retreat to the window, he felt the pull between them tighten, an invisible thread tying their fates together. The weight of her warning settled in his chest, and he knew the road ahead would demand more of him than he had ever imagined. The forest felt alive as Lysander trudged through its dense foliage, his boots crunching over fallen leaves. Sunlight filtered through the canopy, casting dappled shadows across the forest floor, but the brightness did little to ease his unease. Erin walked ahead of him, her movements silent and fluid, as if she were one with the wilderness. She had insisted they leave the safety of his study, claiming that the magic of the bond would only stir deeper in an environment where nature's pulse was strongest. "This is ridiculous," Lysander muttered under his breath, ducking under a low-hanging branch. "What exactly are we supposed to find out here?" Erin didn't turn back, her ears flicking slightly in response to his words. "Answers," she replied, her voice steady. "The bond isn't something that can be ignored, and staying cooped up in your den won't help you understand it." Lysander clenched his jaw but said nothing more. He didn't trust the bond, didn't trust her, even as he felt the pull deep within him, an almost magnetic connection that grew stronger with every passing hour. It wasn't just a sensation. It was a presence, alive and insistent, urging him toward something he couldn't yet grasp. They walked for what felt like hours, the forest growing wilder and thicker the deeper they went. Erin moved with purpose, her sharp eyes scanning the surroundings. Occasionally, she would pause, her nose twitching as if catching a scent, before continuing forward without explanation. Lysander followed, his frustration mounting with each step. Finally, she stopped in a small clearing, her gaze fixed on a cluster of ancient stones covered in moss and faint, glowing runes. The air here felt different, heavier, charged with an energy that made the hairs on the back of Lysander's neck stand on end. "What is this place?" he asked, his voice hushed despite himself. Erin knelt by one of the stones, her fingers brushing over the runes with surprising tenderness. "A nexus," she said, "a place where the veil between the physical and the magical is thin. The bond will reveal itself more clearly here." Lysander frowned, crossing his arms. "Reveal itself? What does that even mean?" She stood, turning to face him, her expression serious. "The bond isn't just a connection. It's a merging of two essences, yours and mine. It will amplify what lies within us, and if we don't learn to control it—" Her voice trailed off, her eyes darkening. "It could consume us." A chill ran down Lysander's spine. He didn't like the sound of that, but before he could voice his concerns, Erin stepped closer. Her presence was overwhelming, her golden eyes locking onto his with an intensity that made it hard to look away. "You feel it, don't you?" she asked, her voice softer now, almost coaxing. "The way it tugs at you, the way it stirs something inside." Lysander swallowed hard, unwilling to admit the truth. He could feel it, an undeniable pull that seemed to tighten with every moment they spent together. It wasn't just physical, it was something deeper, something primal. He nodded reluctantly. Erin's lips curved into a faint smile, though there was no mockery in it this time. "Good. Acknowledge it. That's the first step." She reached out then, her hand brushing against his. The touch was light, almost hesitant, but it sent a jolt through Lysander's body, a surge of warmth that spread through his chest and settled deep in his core. His breath hitched, and he stepped back instinctively, his pulse racing. "What are you doing?" he asked, his voice sharper than he intended. Erin tilted her head, her expression unreadable. "You can't fight the bond, Lysander. It will only make things worse." "I'm not fighting anything," he retorted, though his body betrayed him, his hands trembling slightly. "I just don't understand any of this." Her gaze softened, and for a moment, The fierce predator he had come to associate with her seemed to fade. Then let me show you. She stepped closer again, this time more deliberately, her movements slow and unthreatening. Lysander forced himself to stand his ground as she reached out once more, her hand settling gently on his chest. The contact sent another wave of warmth through him, but this time it was different, calmer, steadier. He could feel her heartbeat through the bond, a steady rhythm that matched his own. Close your eyes, Aaron said softly. Feel it. Against his better judgment, Lysander did as she said. The forest around him seemed to fade away, replaced by a sensation of connection, of being surrounded by something vast and infinite. He could feel Aaron's presence, not just as a physical being but as a part of him, woven into his very essence. It was overwhelming, but it was also comforting. This is what the bond is. Aaron's voice broke through the haze, gentle but firm. A sharing of life, of strength. It's not something to fear. Lysander opened his eyes slowly, meeting her gaze. For the first time, he saw something in her eyes that wasn't predatory or mocking. It was vulnerability, a glimmer of trust that she was offering him. What happens now? He asked, his voice quieter. Aaron's lips curved into a faint smile. Now we learn to trust it, and each other. The words hung in the air between them, heavy with unspoken meaning. Lysander felt the weight of the bond more acutely than ever, but for the first time he wasn't entirely afraid of it. There was something there, something that went beyond magic or vitality. It was a connection that demanded to be understood, no matter how daunting the path ahead seemed. A rustling in the trees broke the moment, and Aaron's ears twitched as she turned toward the sound. Her body tensed, her predator instincts taking over once more. We're not alone, she said, her voice low and urgent. Lysander's hand instinctively went to the dagger at his belt, his senses on high alert. The forest, which had felt so alive moments ago, now seemed ominously still. Whatever was out there, he had a feeling it wasn't friendly. Aaron motioned for him to stay close as she stepped toward the edge of the clearing, her movements silent and deliberate. Lysander followed, his heart pounding in his chest. The bond between them thrummed with a strange energy, as if responding to the tension in the air. As they reached the edge of the clearing, a low growl echoed through the trees, and Lysander felt his stomach drop. Whatever was out there, it was close and it was watching them. The low growl deepened, reverberating through the clearing like a warning bell. Lysander's fingers tightened around the hilt of his dagger as his eyes darted toward the shadows at the edge of the forest. He could feel the air shift, the weight of unseen eyes locked on him and Aaron. Aaron's stance shifted, her knees slightly bent, her hands loose and ready. Her sharp eyes scanned the darkness, her ears twitching to catch every sound. Stay behind me, she said, her voice low but commanding. I can handle myself, Lysander replied, though his grip on the dagger betrayed his nervousness. Aaron didn't spare him a glance, her focus unwavering. This isn't something you can fight with a blade, she said. Not alone. Before he could respond, the bushes rustled, and a massive creature stepped into the clearing. It was unlike anything Lysander had ever seen. A hulking beast covered in dark, matted fur, its eyes glowing an unnatural yellow. Its claws glinted in the dappled sunlight, and its snout curled into a snarl, revealing jagged teeth that dripped with saliva. Aaron's lips pulled back in a snarl of her own, her body lowering into a predatory crouch. The bond between them hummed with a sharp intensity, and Lysander felt a surge of energy rush through him, a connection he couldn't quite explain but couldn't deny. The creature growled again, taking a menacing step forward. Aaron matched its movement, her muscles coiled like a spring ready to snap. This is a territorial beast, she murmured, just loud enough for Lysander to hear. It sees us as a threat. Then we should leave, Lysander suggested, though he doubted the creature would simply let them walk away. Aaron shook her head, her eyes never leaving the beast. It won't stop unless it's driven off. Running will only make us prey. The beast lunged, and Aaron moved like lightning, intercepting it mid-strike. Her claws slashed through the air, meeting the creatures with a sharp crack. Lysander stumbled back, his heart pounding as the two predators clashed. The bond thrummed wildly, and he felt Erin's focus, her raw determination, as if it were his own. The fight was a blur of movement, Erin's agile strikes countering the beast's brute strength. She was fast, precise, but the creature was relentless. It swiped at her with massive claws, narrowly missing as she ducked and rolled out of its reach. Despite her skill, the beast's sheer size and power made it a formidable opponent. Lysander's instincts screamed at him to run, but something held him in place. The bond surged again, a pulse of energy that left him breathless. He could feel Erin's exhaustion, the strain of the fight taking its toll. Gritting his teeth, he tightened his grip on the dagger and stepped forward. "Erin!" he called, his voice cutting through the chaos. She glanced at him, her golden eyes flashing with frustration. "Stay back!" she snarled, but the beast took advantage of her distraction, swiping at her with its massive paw. The blow caught her shoulder, sending her sprawling to the ground. "Erin!" Lysander shouted, his heart lurching. Without thinking, he surged forward, the bond fueling his movements. He threw himself between her and the beast, raising his dagger in a desperate attempt to defend her. The creature roared, its claws slashing toward him. Lysander braced for impact, but before the blow could land, a sudden surge of energy erupted from the bond. It radiated outward, a pulse of raw power that stopped the beast in its tracks. The air shimmered, and the creature staggered back, its snarls turning to confused whines. Erin pushed herself to her feet, her hand pressed against her injured shoulder. She stared at Lysander, her expression a mix of shock and something else. Something like respect. "What did you just do?" she asked, her voice breathless. "I don't know," Lysander admitted, his hand trembling as he lowered the dagger. He could still feel the bond's energy coursing through him, a wild, untamed force that he didn't fully understand. The beast hesitated, its glowing eyes flicking between them. It let out a low growl before retreating into the forest, its massive form disappearing into the shadows. The clearing fell silent, save for the sound of Lysander's ragged breathing. Erin approached him slowly, her gaze intense. "That wasn't just the bond," she said, her tone laced with curiosity. "That was you." Lysander shook his head, still trying to process what had happened. "I didn't do anything. It just happened." She studied him for a moment, then reached out, her fingers brushing against his arm. The touch was brief, but it sent a familiar warmth through him, a reminder of their connection. "The bond amplifies what's already within us," she said. "Whatever that was, it came from you." He met her gaze, searching for answers in her golden eyes. "What does that mean?" "It means you're not as ordinary as you think," she said simply. "And neither is this bond." Lysander looked down at his hands, the faint tremor still present. The bond was more than he had realized, more than either of them had realized. It wasn't just a connection. It was a catalyst, unlocking something within him that he hadn't known existed. Erin turned toward the edge of the clearing, her sharp ears twitching as she listened for any signs of the beast's return. Satisfied that they were safe for the moment, she glanced back at him. "We need to keep moving. There's more to this bond than either of us understand, and we won't find answers standing here." He nodded, his resolve hardening. The fear and confusion that had plagued him since the bond's creation were still there, but now they were tempered by something else, a spark of determination. Whatever this bond was, whatever it meant, he was going to figure it out, and he wasn't going to do it alone. As they left the clearing behind, the forest seemed quieter, almost reverent. Lysander couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted, not just within him, but between him and Erin. The bond wasn't just a tether. It was a bridge, connecting two vastly different worlds. And for better or worse, they were in this together. The evening sun dipped below the treetops, painting the forest in hues of amber and deep green as Lysander and Erin made their way back to the cabin. The air was cooler now, carrying the scent of damp earth and pine. Neither of them had spoken much since the confrontation with the beast, though the tension between them had shifted. It was no longer antagonistic but laden with unspoken questions. Erin's movements were slower than usual, her hand occasionally brushing against her shoulder. The claw marks the beast had left were hidden beneath her tunic, but Lysander could tell they still pained her. He had offered to stop and tend to them earlier, but she had refused with a dismissive shake of her head. As they neared the cabin, Lysander finally broke the silence. "You're still hurt. Let me take a look." Erin glanced at him, her golden eyes narrowing slightly as if considering his offer. She let out a soft huff but didn't argue. "Fine, but don't get any ideas, human." Lysander rolled his eyes, pushing open the cabin door and stepping aside to let her in. "Trust me. The last thing I want is to argue with you about my intentions again." She smirked faintly but said nothing, moving toward the table in the center of the room and sitting down with a wince. Lysander grabbed a clean cloth and a small jar of salve from a shelf, his movements brisk and efficient. He pulled up a chair across from her, setting the supplies down. "Let me see," he said, gesturing toward her injured shoulder. Erin hesitated for a moment before pulling her tunic aside, exposing the claw marks. The gashes were deep but clean, the skin around them red and swollen. Lysander frowned, his brow furrowing as he soaked the cloth in water. "This might sting," he warned, pressing the damp cloth gently against the wounds. Erin didn't flinch, though her ears flicked slightly. She watched him with a curious intensity, as if trying to decipher his thoughts. Lysander focused on cleaning the wounds, his touch careful despite the tension in his jaw. "You're good at this," Erin said after a moment, her tone almost casual. "Years of living alone," Lysander replied. "You learn to take care of yourself." She tilted her head, her expression softening. "Alone? No family?" "Not anymore," he said shortly, not looking up. The answer seemed to close the topic, and Erin didn't press further. As he worked, the bond hummed softly between them, a steady presence that neither could ignore. It wasn't as overpowering as it had been in the clearing, but it was there, threading through every movement, every glance. Lysander could feel Erin's gaze on him, and for once, it didn't feel scrutinizing. It felt thoughtful. "You're different," Erin said suddenly, breaking the silence. "Most humans would have run from that fight, but you stood your ground." Lysander shrugged, dabbing salve onto her wounds. "I wasn't going to let you face it alone." "That's not what I meant," she said, her voice quieter now. "You didn't just stand your ground. You protected me." He paused, meeting her gaze. The vulnerability in her expression caught him off guard, and for a moment, he didn't know what to say. Finally, he cleared his throat and returned to his task. "It's what anyone would have done." Erin laughed softly, the sound carrying a hint of bitterness. "You give your kind too much credit." Lysander didn't argue. Instead, he finished tending to her wounds and leaned back, his hands resting on his knees. "There. That should keep it from getting infected." Erin pulled her tunic back into place, rolling her shoulder experimentally. "Not bad," she admitted. "For a human." Lysander chuckled despite himself, shaking his head. "Glad I could meet your standards." The lightness of the moment lingered, easing some of the tension that had built between them. Erin stood, moving to the window and gazing out at the darkening forest. Her silhouette was framed by the soft glow of the setting sun, her tail flicking idly. "You're stronger than you realize," she said after a long pause, her back still to him. "The bond wouldn't have chosen you otherwise." Lysander frowned, leaning forward in his chair. "The bond didn't choose me. It was an accident." "Maybe," she said, turning to face him, "but accidents don't create this kind of connection. The bond recognizes potential even if you don't." He opened his mouth to argue but stopped when he saw the look in her eyes. It wasn't challenging or mocking. It was earnest, almost hopeful. He sighed, running a hand through his hair. "If that's true, then what does it want from us?" "From me." Erin stepped closer, the bond thrumming faintly between them. "Maybe it's not about what it wants. Maybe it's about what we're capable of." The words hung in the air, heavy with meaning. Lysander felt the weight of her gaze, the pull of the bond urging him to trust, to believe. It was a leap he wasn't sure he was ready to take, but something about the way she looked at him made him want to try. The moment stretched, the cabin bathed in the golden light of dusk. Erin's expression softened, and she reached out, her hand brushing against his. The touch was light, tentative, but it sent a familiar warmth through him. He didn't pull away. "We'll figure it out," she said softly. "Together." Lysander nodded, his heart pounding in his chest. Together, as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting the room into shadow, the bond between them seemed to pulse with quiet understanding. For the first time, Lysander felt a glimmer of hope, not just for himself, but for the fragile connection they were beginning to forge. The next day dawned with a hazy mist hanging low over the forest. Lysander and Erin prepared for their journey further into the woods, toward the location she believed might hold answers about the bond. The air between them felt less strained, the unspoken truce from the night before easing some of the friction. Still, Lysander couldn't shake the weight of the unknown pressing on his thoughts. Erin led the way, her movements fluid and sure despite her injured shoulder. She didn't complain, though Lysander noticed the subtle tension in her posture. He kept close, his eyes scanning the trees for any sign of danger. The bond hummed quietly between them, a constant reminder of the link they shared. After hours of walking, they reached a small clearing where the sun broke through the canopy, illuminating the mossy ground. Erin stopped, her ears twitching as she surveyed the area. "We're close," she said, her voice low. "I can feel it." "Feel what?" Lysander asked, wiping sweat from his brow. She turned to him, her golden eyes intense. "There's an old sanctuary nearby. It's said to be a place where bonds like ours were first forged. If there are answers, they'll be there." Lysander frowned, glancing around the clearing. "You're sure it's safe?" "No," she admitted, her expression hardening. "But we don't have a choice." He nodded, gripping the hilt of his dagger. "Lead the way." They continued through the forest, the terrain becoming rougher as they climbed a gentle incline. The trees grew denser, their twisted roots creating natural barriers. The air was heavier here, almost oppressive, and Lysander could feel the bond pulsing faintly, as if reacting to the environment. Finally, they emerged into another clearing, this one dominated by the ruins of an ancient structure. Moss-covered stones jutted from the earth, forming the remnants of what had once been walls and arches. In the center stood a crumbling pedestal, its surface etched with intricate carvings that glowed faintly in the dim light. Erin approached the pedestal cautiously, her eyes scanning the carvings. "This is it," she said, her voice reverent. "The sanctuary." Lysander followed her, his gaze drawn to the glowing symbols. "What do they mean?" "They're stories," Erin explained, running her fingers over the carvings. "Stories of those who came before us, who formed bonds to unite our worlds." Lysander watched her, noting the way her expression softened as she studied the pedestal. For a moment, she seemed less like the fierce, guarded warrior he had come to know and more like someone searching for a piece of themselves. "What are you hoping to find here?" he asked gently. Erin hesitated, her hand lingering on the carvings. "The truth," she said finally, "about the bond, about why it chose us." Before Lysander could respond, the air around them shifted. A faint hum filled the clearing, growing louder with each passing moment. The pedestal began to glow more brightly, the symbols pulsing in time with the bond. Erin stepped back, her ears flattening. "Something's happening." Lysander felt it too, a pull deep within him, as if the bond were resonating with the sanctuary. He staggered slightly, his vision swimming as the energy intensified. Erin reached out, steadying him with a firm grip on his arm. "Stay with me," she said, her voice urgent. The glow from the pedestal expanded, enveloping them in a warm, golden light. Lysander felt a surge of emotion, fear, longing, hope, all flooding through the bond. It was overwhelming, yet somehow familiar, as if the sanctuary were amplifying what was already within them. The light began to coalesce, forming a faint figure above the pedestal. It was humanoid but indistinct, its features blurred and shifting. When it spoke, its voice was soft yet resonant, echoing in the space around them. "You have come seeking answers," the figure said. "The bond you share is ancient, forged in the fires of unity and sacrifice." Erin stepped forward, her expression determined. "Why us? Why now?" The figure turned its gaze toward her, though its eyes were nothing more than points of light. "The bond does not choose lightly. It recognizes strength, compassion, and the potential to bridge the divide between our worlds." Lysander swallowed hard, his mind racing. "But we didn't ask for this. We don't even understand it." "Understanding will come in time," the figure replied. "But know this, the bond is not merely a connection. It is a catalyst capable of great power if nurtured. It can heal what is broken or destroy if neglected." The words hung heavily in the air, the weight of their implications sinking in. Lysander glanced at Erin, who looked equally shaken but resolute. "What do we need to do?" she asked. The figure's light dimmed slightly, its form growing fainter. "Trust in each other. Learn from one another. The bond will guide you, but only if you allow it." Before either of them could ask more, the figure dissolved into the air, leaving the pedestal dark and silent once again. The clearing seemed quieter than before, the hum of energy fading into stillness. Erin turned to Lysander, her expression unreadable. "Well," she said after a moment, "that was unexpected." "You think," Lysander replied, his voice tinged with nervous humor. He ran a hand through his hair, trying to make sense of what had just happened. "So, what now?" Erin's gaze softened, and she placed a hand on his shoulder. "We do what it said. We trust each other." The simplicity of her words struck him, and he nodded slowly. "Together," he said, echoing the sentiment they had shared the night before. Erin smiled faintly, a rare but genuine expression that eased some of the tension in his chest. Together, as they left the sanctuary behind, the bond felt stronger, more stable. Whatever challenges lay ahead, Lysander knew they would face them side by side. For the first time, the path forward didn't seem quite so daunting. The journey back from the sanctuary was marked by an almost meditative quiet. Erin led the way, her ears alert to the sounds of the forest, while Lysander followed a few steps behind. The words of the mysterious figure echoed in his mind, filling the silence with questions he didn't yet know how to ask. He could feel the bond more acutely now, like a thread linking him to Erin with every step they took. It was no longer just a strange sensation. It was a presence, alive and dynamic. The forest around them grew darker as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows over the dense foliage. Erin slowed her pace, her tail flicking with subtle tension. "We should stop for the night," she said, glancing back at him. "The forest isn't safe after dark." Lysander nodded, scanning the area for a suitable spot. They found a small clearing sheltered by overhanging branches, the ground soft with moss and fallen leaves. Erin began gathering wood for a fire while Lysander set up a makeshift perimeter using tripwires and small, jangling bells, a trick he had picked up in his travels. Once the fire was lit, the warm glow pushed back the encroaching darkness. Erin sat cross-legged on the ground, her sharp eyes reflecting the flames, while Lysander leaned against a nearby tree. For a while, neither of them spoke, content to let the crackling of the fire fill the void. "You've changed," Erin said suddenly, her voice cutting through the quiet. Lysander looked up, startled. "What do you mean?" "You're not the same man I met in that cabin," she said, her gaze steady. "When we first crossed paths, you were guarded, distrustful. But now you're different, more open." He frowned, considering her words. "Maybe that's because I've had no choice but to trust you. This bond, it forces us to rely on each other." "It's more than that," Erin insisted. She leaned forward, resting her elbows on her knees. "The bond might connect us, but you've made the choice to stand beside me, to fight with me. That's not something the bond can force." Her words struck a chord, and Lysander found himself at a loss for a response. He stared into the fire, the dancing flames mirroring the turmoil in his thoughts. "What about you?" he asked after a moment. "Do you think you've changed?" Erin's ears flicked, and she let out a soft, almost bitter laugh. "I've spent my whole life thinking I didn't need anyone, that I could handle whatever came my way on my own. But now," she hesitated, her voice growing quieter, "now I'm starting to realize how wrong I was." The vulnerability in her tone caught him off guard. He shifted closer, his gaze searching hers. "That's not a weakness, you know. Admitting you need help, it takes strength." She looked at him, her golden eyes softening. "Maybe, or maybe it's just desperation." "It's not," he said firmly. "You've been strong this whole time, Erin. Stronger than anyone I've ever met." For a moment, the bond between them seemed to hum louder, the air charged with unspoken emotion. Erin's gaze didn't waver, and Lysander felt the pull of the connection urging him closer. Before he could stop himself, he reached out, his hand brushing against hers. Erin didn't pull away. Instead, her fingers curled around his, her touch warm and grounding. "Lysander," she began, her voice barely above a whisper. "This bond, it's not just about survival anymore, is it?" "No," he admitted, his throat tight. "It's not." The silence that followed was heavy but not uncomfortable. It was the kind of silence that spoke volumes, the kind that didn't need words to convey meaning. Slowly, Erin leaned toward him, her movements deliberate yet uncharacteristically hesitant. When her forehead rested against his, Lysander felt his breath catch. "Thank you," she murmured, her eyes closing briefly. "For staying." He swallowed hard, his heart pounding in his chest. "Always." The moment lingered, the firelight casting flickering shadows over their faces. Lysander felt an overwhelming sense of closeness, not just physical but emotional. The bond between them pulsed gently, a reminder of the connection they now shared. Eventually, Erin pulled back, her cheeks tinged with a faint blush. She cleared her throat, the familiar edge returning to her voice. "We should get some rest. Tomorrow's going to be another long day." Lysander nodded, though his thoughts were far from settled. He lay down near the fire, using his pack as a makeshift pillow. Erin stretched out on the other side, her tail curling around her legs as she watched the flames. Despite the exhaustion weighing on him, Lysander couldn't sleep. His mind replayed the events of the day, the sanctuary, the figure's cryptic words, and the quiet moment he and Erin had shared. The bond thrummed faintly, a steady rhythm that matched the beating of his heart. As the fire burned low, Lysander's gaze drifted to Erin. Her breathing had evened out, and her features were relaxed, free of the tension that so often defined them. In sleep, she looked peaceful, almost fragile, a stark contrast to the fierce warrior he had come to know. He closed his eyes, the bond's warmth lulling him into a restless slumber. Whatever lay ahead, he knew they would face it together. And for the first time, that thought didn't fill him with dread. It filled him with hope. The morning came quietly, the forest bathed in the soft light of dawn. Erin was already awake when Lysander stirred, crouching near the dying embers of the fire. Her ears flicked toward him as he sat up, stretching stiff muscles from a night spent on the ground. "You didn't sleep much," he remarked, his voice still rough from sleep. "I don't need as much as you," she replied, her tone neutral. "Besides, someone needed to keep watch." Lysander frowned but didn't argue. He knew she was right. The woods could be treacherous, especially now that they were growing closer to their goal. Still, he couldn't help but feel a pang of guilt for leaving her to shoulder the burden alone. After a quick meal of dried rations, they broke camp and resumed their journey. The bond hummed faintly, a constant presence that neither of them mentioned, but both seemed to acknowledge in the way they moved together. Lysander adjusting his pace to match hers, Erin subtly shielding him from the thicker underbrush. It was an unspoken rhythm, one that felt oddly natural despite the strangeness of their situation. By midday, the forest began to change. The trees grew taller, their trunks gnarled and ancient, and the air carried a faint metallic tang. Erin slowed, her ears swiveling as she scanned their surroundings. "We're close," she said, her voice low. "The place I told you about. It's just ahead." Lysander tightened his grip on his weapon, a dagger he'd carried since his mercenary days. "What exactly are we looking for?" "An artifact," Erin explained, her golden eyes narrowing as she peered through the trees. "Something that might help us understand the bond. It's said to amplify its power." "Amplify?" Lysander echoed, unease creeping into his voice. "That doesn't sound safe." "It's not," Erin admitted, "but we don't have any other options." They pushed forward, the undergrowth giving way to a clearing. At its center stood a towering stone monolith, its surface covered in intricate carvings that glowed faintly, much like the pedestal in the sanctuary. The air around it seemed to hum with energy, and the bond flared in response, sending a shiver down Lysander's spine. "This is it," Erin said, her voice tinged with awe and apprehension. She approached the monolith cautiously, her movements careful and deliberate. Lysander followed, his gaze fixed on the strange structure. "What do we do now?" Erin hesitated before reaching out to touch the monolith. The moment her fingers brushed the stone, the carvings flared to life, the glow intensifying until the entire clearing was bathed in golden light. The bond surged, a wave of energy that left Lysander breathless. The light coalesced into a series of symbols hovering in the air, their meaning indecipherable to Lysander but clearly significant to Erin. Her expression shifted, a mix of recognition and alarm flashing across her face. "What is it?" he asked, stepping closer. "It's a warning," she said, her voice tight. "The bond, it wasn't just created for unity. It was meant to contain something, a power that could destroy us if left unchecked." Lysander felt a cold knot of fear settle in his stomach. "Destroy us how?" Erin shook her head, her ears flattening. "I don't know, but whatever it is, it's tied to us. If we don't figure out how to control the bond, we could unleash it." Before either of them could say more, the ground beneath them trembled. The monolith's glow flickered, then flared brighter than ever. Erin yanked her hand back, but it was too late. The energy erupted in a blinding flash, sending both of them sprawling. When Lysander's vision cleared, he saw that the monolith had changed. Its carvings were no longer glowing, but instead pulsating with a dark, malevolent light. The air around it felt heavier, oppressive, as if something ancient and dangerous had been awakened. Erin pushed herself to her feet, her expression grim. "We need to go. Now." "What about the artifact?" Lysander asked, stumbling to his feet. "We can't risk it," she said, her voice sharp. "Not until we know more." They turned to leave, but the bond flared violently, stopping them in their tracks. Lysander gasped, clutching his chest as a surge of energy coursed through him. Erin cried out, her knees buckling as the bond overwhelmed her. Through the haze of pain, Lysander heard a low, guttural growl. He turned his head and froze. Emerging from the shadows of the forest were figures, creatures with twisted, bestial forms and glowing red eyes. Their presence radiated malice, and Lysander felt the bond react to them, as if warning him of the danger they posed. "Erin," he said, his voice strained, "we've got company." She forced herself to stand, her hands trembling as she drew her weapon. "They're drawn to the bond," she said, her voice shaking with both fear and fury. "They can sense its power." Lysander readied his dagger, his heart pounding as the creatures closed in. The bond pulsed wildly, a chaotic rhythm that mirrored the adrenaline coursing through his veins. He glanced at Erin, who stood beside him, her golden eyes fierce despite the fear etched into her features. "Together?" he asked, his voice steady despite the chaos around them. "Together," she replied, a determined edge to her voice. The creatures lunged, and the clearing erupted into chaos. Lysander and Erin fought side by side, their movements almost synchronized as the bond seemed to guide them. Despite their best efforts, the creatures were relentless, their sheer numbers threatening to overwhelm them. As the fight dragged on, Lysander realized they couldn't win. Not like this. He glanced at the monolith, its dark light pulsating ominously. Desperation gripped him, and he shouted to Aaron, "We need to do something about that thing." Aaron nodded, her expression grim. "Cover me." Lysander held the creatures at bay as Aaron sprinted toward the monolith. She hesitated only for a moment before placing both hands on the stone, her face contorted with effort as she channeled the bond's energy. The carvings flared brighter, the dark light clashing with a golden glow that seemed to emanate from her. The ground trembled again, and a deafening roar echoed through the clearing. Lysander fought to keep his footing as the monolith erupted in a brilliant explosion of light. The creatures let out pained shrieks before dissolving into shadows, leaving the clearing eerily quiet. When the light faded, the monolith was gone. Erin collapsed to her knees, her breathing ragged. Lysander rushed to her side, his heart racing. "Erin," he said, his voice filled with concern. "Are you okay?" She looked up at him, her eyes glowing faintly with the bond's energy. "I'm fine," she said, though her voice was weak. "But this isn't over." Lysander nodded, helping her to her feet. As they stood together in the empty clearing, the bond pulsed gently, a reminder of the power they had barely begun to understand. The clearing was silent now, the oppressive hum of the bond reduced to a faint thrum that coursed between them. Lysander helped Erin to her feet, steadying her as her legs wobbled. Her golden eyes glimmered faintly, their usual sharpness dulled by exhaustion. "That was close," Lysander said, his voice low but firm. He surveyed the area, scanning for any lingering threats. The creatures were gone, reduced to mere shadows that seemed to melt into the forest floor. But the unease in his chest lingered. Erin nodded, her breathing still labored. Too close. Whatever power the monolith held, it was connected to the bond. I could feel it pulling at us. He tightened his grip on her arm, his expression dark. "Then it's a good thing you destroyed it. But what now? If that was only part of what this bond is capable of, it means we're running out of time," she interrupted, her voice regaining some of its usual determination. She straightened, gently pulling away from him to stand on her own. "The bond isn't just a connection, Lysander. It's a force, one that we have to learn to control. Otherwise," she trailed off, but the meaning of her words was clear. The bond wasn't a gift. It was a burden, one that could easily spiral into something catastrophic if left unchecked. The two of them began walking, the forest around them eerily calm after the chaos of the fight. The bond pulsed gently, its rhythm steady but insistent, as if urging them forward. Neither of them spoke, the weight of the encounter hanging heavy between them. As the day wore on, the dense forest began to thin, giving way to rolling hills bathed in the golden light of late afternoon. They found a quiet spot near a stream to rest, the sound of running water providing a soothing backdrop to their thoughts. Lysander sat on a fallen log, his dagger resting across his knees. Erin knelt by the stream, splashing cool water on her face and arms. The tension between them was palpable, a quiet storm that neither of them seemed willing to address. Finally, Lysander broke the silence. "Back at the monolith, when you said the bond could destroy us, what did you mean?" Erin paused, her hands hovering over the water. Her ears twitched slightly before she turned to face him, her expression serious. "The bond is more than just a link between us. It's ancient, tied to forces that neither of us fully understand. If it grows too strong, if we can't control it, it could consume us. Our will, our thoughts, everything." Lysander's jaw tightened, his knuckles white as he gripped the hilt of his dagger. "So we're just supposed to live with this thing hanging over our heads, hoping it doesn't destroy us?" "No," she said firmly, her golden eyes locking onto his. "We're going to figure this out. Together." He studied her for a moment, the determination in her gaze like a beacon cutting through his doubt. Despite everything, she had faith, not just in herself, but in him, in them. It was a sobering realization, one that left him feeling both humbled and strangely hopeful. "Together," he agreed, his voice steady. Erin smiled faintly, the tension in her shoulders easing. She moved to sit beside him, the bond thrumming gently as she settled close enough for their arms to brush. The proximity was both comforting and electric, the connection between them feeling more tangible than ever. For a while, they sat in silence, the soft murmur of the stream filling the air. Lysander found himself watching Erin out of the corner of his eye, the way the fading sunlight played off her fur, the way her ears twitched slightly at every distant sound. She was so different from anyone he had ever known, and yet, in this moment, she felt like the one constant he could rely on. "You've changed, you know," she said suddenly, her voice breaking the quiet. He raised an eyebrow, turning to look at her. "You keep saying that. What do you mean?" "You're not just surviving anymore," she said, her tone thoughtful. "When we first met, it was like you were carrying the weight of the world on your shoulders, like you didn't trust anyone to share it. But now you've let me in, and I think you've let yourself in too." Lysander chuckled softly, the sound tinged with self-deprecation. "Maybe I've just gotten used to you bossing me around." Erin laughed, the sound light and genuine. "Or maybe you're finally realizing that you don't have to do everything alone." The bond pulsed warmly between them, a quiet affirmation of her words. Lysander glanced down at their hands, which were resting close together on the log. Without thinking, he reached out, his fingers brushing against hers. Erin didn't pull away. Instead, she intertwined her fingers with his, her touch firm yet gentle. "I don't know what the future holds," Lysander admitted, his voice quiet, "but I do know one thing. Whatever happens, I'm not going anywhere." Erin's gaze softened, and for a moment, the bond seemed to hum louder, a steady rhythm that matched the beating of his heart. "Neither am I," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. The sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in hues of orange and purple. The two of them sat together as the first stars began to appear, the bond a quiet, unyielding presence that bound them in ways words could never fully capture. For the first time, Lysander didn't feel afraid of the bond. He didn't see it as a curse or a burden. It was a challenge, yes, but it was also a connection, a partnership forged in the crucible of shared struggle and mutual trust. And as long as they faced it together, he knew they could withstand whatever came next. The night deepened, and the world around them seemed to fade into the background. In that quiet moment, with Erin's hand in his and the bond thrumming steadily between them, Lysander felt something he hadn't felt in a long time: hope.